Welcome everyone to today's webinar. This is our second webinar for Fleet Management Awareness Month. I'm happy you all could join us today. We have a special presentation here today by Connie Aaron from, she's a federal fleet property expert. Before I read her bio and we get started, just some administrative things about the webinar. This is a recorded webinar, and it will be posted up on our MPMA YouTube channel later this month. Secondly, if you have any questions during the presentation, go ahead and put your question in the chat box, and we will answer that towards the end of the presentation. And then lastly is, if there are folks listening as a group, we want you to be able to get your CEU credit. So if there are members altogether, if you send an email to myself, sorry, this is Kim Sager, then send an email to me and we can get all the CEUs loaded in for everybody that's listening today. So with that, let's learn a little bit about Connie. So Connie Aaron has worked in fleet management for a federal agency for over 28 years. Early in her career, she managed a fleet of 6,000 vehicles in the DC metro area. She currently works in a regulatory office and is an expert in federal motor vehicle and personal property regulations and policies. She is also a certified federal fleet manager with NPMA. And her presentation today is contractor use of government vehicles. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Connie. How are you?
Good, good. Thanks for the nice introduction. I wanted to thank everyone for coming and spending your afternoon with us, just an hour. It won't be all afternoon, but it's important to get education throughout your career, whether you're new to property management or been in there for 30 years, things change. New people come along, new ideas. And so we appreciate you coming in, participating in the webinar today. I've been in fleet management my entire career, and over the years, contractor use of government vehicles is a very popular subject. There are many federal agencies where it's basically all contractors helping to accomplish that mission, and you'll just have one government person on site managing an entire group of contractors. So, and then there are other places and other agencies where you don't have any contractors, but every now and then somebody will come along and say, oh, we have this IT contractor, he needs the government vehicle. And so whether you're the fleet manager or just a property manager, but you need to know where to go for help when someone does ask you that question. So I'm going to move along, I think. Okay, there we go. So whenever I talk about the federal government fleet, I just like to show how big it is and how much of an impact, as if you're in the federal arena, you're having on motor vehicle fleets. And so the total inventory is about 645,000 vehicles. These are the FY18 numbers. There's 21 large fleets in the federal government that has more than 2,000 vehicles in their fleet. Miles traveled is 464 billion with an operating cost of 3.6 billion. The composition of the federal fleet is surprisingly, most people aren't aware of this, it's 64% trucks, 34% sedans, and less than 2% buses, ambulances, special equipment. Because when you're out as a civilian on the road, you usually see the sedans. But most of the government fleet is trucks. It's a work fleet. The composition of the federal fleet is 36% is the Postal Service, 38% are civilian federal agencies, and 26% are military federal agencies. And then what are they composed of? 69% of the vehicles are agency owned, meaning it's the agency that owns the asset, manages it, and uses it to accomplish their mission. 30% of the federal fleet is leased from GSA Fleet, and less than 1% is a commercial lease. So just a little background on why we're discussing this topic today. Like I said, this question comes up a lot at work in a regulatory office. And everything that I'm going to go over today is because these are government-wide regulations for the executive branch agencies. But if you're outside the federal government or you're with a judicial branch or legislative branch, some of it may still be applicable, but most follow these guidelines, even if they're not an executive branch agency. And just want to keep in mind that the government-wide regulations that I'm going to go over today are as a foundation for your agency to write their own guidance and regulations. And when we get to the end of the presentation, I'm going to show you a couple of samples of some agency guidance that were written about contractor use of vehicles. And so just one of the basic things between a federal employee versus a contractor using a government vehicle, as a federal employee, you take an oath to solemnly swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, and that's 5 U.S.C. 3331. But as a contractor employees take no such oath. They follow the direction of their employer and the terms of the contract. That's so as a federal manager, it's important that you understand the rules and regulations and your own liability for allowing contractors to use government vehicles at your place of work. There are many missions in the federal government that require a non-federal person to drive or ride in a government vehicle. We understand that. Each federal agency will have their own internal directives regarding contractor use of government vehicles. I'm going to keep reiterating that throughout this presentation, is be aware of what your internal guidance is and see how it falls into the framework of the government-wide guidance. The number one concern is protection from liability, because contractors may not be covered by the Federal Tort Claims Act, which only protects federal employees. And it's your job as a fleet manager to protect the federal government's position and allowing a contractor to use a federal owned, leased, or owned or leased vehicle. So as a federal fleet manager, what should I take into consideration? I just put these down. It's not an exhaustive list. I'm sure because of your mission requirements, you may have other things you need to take into consideration. But the first one is it advantageous to the government for the government to provide the asset, i.e. the motor vehicle, to accomplish the agency's mission? Has the contracting officer authorized it? And it's the contracting officer of the contract that has the contractor on site. Have they authorized it? Has the contractor, i.e. the driver, provided proof of insurance and a valid state license for the type of vehicle being operated? And that's important. You may have contractors that require a CDL for a specialty type of vehicle to be operated in your state. As a fleet manager, it's your responsibility to make sure the drivers, whether they're federal or contractors, are properly licensed for the type of vehicle being operated in that state. I'm going to go over a little bit of that later too with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Act and how that pertains to contractors. If you're using GSA fleet leased vehicles, is the contractor obtaining and paying for the vehicles directly to GSA fleet, or using a leased vehicle provided by your agency? Or is the contractor using an agency-owned vehicle? There are differences in whether you say you're with the Army, and as the Army fleet manager, you have 15 GSA fleet leased vehicles on site. but you're the one leasing them from GSA Fleet. But you allow on-site contractors to use them, like a motor pool, to check vehicles in and out for the day. There are other situations where an agency and GSA Fleet has authorized a contractor to lease directly from them to accomplish the mission and the requirements of the contract. And when that happens and the contractor is paying GSA Fleet directly, there are some other government-wide regulations that come into play about the management of that contract. So that's a question to ask as an agency fleet manager. And then how should I educate the agency drivers, federal and contractors, on their responsibilities to obey state and local traffic laws? In your role as a fleet manager, you need to assess, is it you that will be educating the federal employees as well as the contractors? And you will see in the government-wide regulation that allows contractors to use government vehicles, there's an education portion to that. And so as the fleet manager, you need to see, is that your responsibility, or is there someone else in your agency, or perhaps the contracting office, who's responsible for making sure that contractors are trained properly? Do the agency drivers, federal and contractors, know what to do if a vehicle breaks down or is in an accident? Drivers, no matter which, if they're federal or contractors, just need to know what to do about safely getting vehicles off to the side of the road. Who are they supposed to contact? As a fleet manager, is that your responsibility to make sure both sets of drivers are aware of it? And if so, again, we go back to the education thing. How are you going to educate the drivers on what to do in those situations? And then who do you call for questions about contractor use of GOVs and POVs in your agency for official business? As a fleet manager, you just may be managing the asset. Well, you're not managing the contract employees, but a contract employee may ask you a question about using a government vehicle, or if something happens to the government vehicle, you need to know who you can call for help in your agency. And hopefully in the presentation, I can guide you where to go to get answers and to get you help as a fleet manager. I'm going to first go over the regulatory resources. And I want you, information is knowledge. Knowledge is information. And where do you go to get these things? And so we're having everything available at your fingertips, at your computer, is fabulous, because you can do an internet search on anything these days, and you can usually find an answer to your questions. But I want you to understand where the regulations come from, the government-wide ones, and how they trickle down into your individual agency regulations and policies. So on a daily basis, the Federal Register has a publication. There's the website for it. You can put search engine into it where it will email you daily. Like if you put the term motor vehicle, government motor vehicles, anytime there's a regulatory change for government motor vehicles, it will email you each time that appears. And so the most recent one, I think, was in December, and it just happened to be on the topic of contractor use of government vehicles. And it was the FAR folks are looking into the reporting requirements for contractor use of government vehicles. And so I got an alert, I got an email from the Federal Register saying, hey, there's a publication out today, about motor vehicles, go look at it. So those are daily. Then there's the Code of Federal Regulations, i.e. CFR, and we're going to be going over a few of those today that are part of, so the CFR trickles down into what is the Federal Property Management Regulation and the Federal Management Regulation, the FPMR and the FMR. and we're going to go over some government-wide regulations from the FPMR and the FMR that are all part of the bigger document, the CFR. And then, of course, when you're talking about contracting, you can't get away. You have to pull up the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations. And I'm going to show you the regulation that points directly to contractor use of government vehicles in the FAR. And then I'm going to tell you more about individual agency regulations and policies and show you a couple examples. Many of these can be found in a simple internet search. And so if you're with Department of Agriculture and you want to know what your agency policy is about contractor use of government vehicles, you can just do a little Google search and come up, if you don't know where to already find it within your own agency. There's so many examples out there. More regulatory resources. I kind of touched earlier on Federal Tort Claims Act, and I wanted you to have a link so you could read it. The Federal Tort Claims Act protects federal employees in the United States from personal liability if you're acting within the scope of employment to accomplish your agency's mission. Boy, that's a tongue twister. So basically, if you're a federal employee and you're driving a government vehicle and you're within the scope of duty performing your agency's mission and you get into an accident, in most situations, your agency will cover you from any personal liability for the because of the Federal Tort Claims Act. So just wanted to show that, and notice I stressed that it's federal employees. But each agency implements the Federal Tort Claims Act a little differently. And so you would need to look at your agency internal policy or even ask your agency general counsel's office, hey, we have contractors driving government vehicles. Are they covered by the Federal Tort Claims Act? And most likely they're going to say no. But then, you know, it kind of, when you talk about contractors, it kind of like, it goes into other areas, whether it's a visiting foreign scientist working at an energy lab. They're not really a contractor, but they're covered by an agreement. Or if there's a volunteer on site, covered by another agreement. These are the things you need to research before handing keys out to folks. Hey, what authority do they have to drive this government vehicle? And what is protecting their own personal liability and the liability of the federal government? So then next, I wanted to give you the link for government contractor insurance requirement. Remember, I talked about the FAR on the previous slide. There's the link to the FAR clause that will be in the contract that allows the contractor to use the government vehicle. And that's a requirement they have insurance, and I'll talk more about that later. And then agency, contractor, and personal liability. Where does that fall into play? That link will take you to that. Most things I have linking through government printing office, so you shouldn't have any problems finding it. I just wanted to touch a little bit on what Government Accountability Office is. They issue decisions through the Comptroller General on the use of appropriations. And so if you are just curious of what has happened in the past about certain situations, say you have a contractor driving a government vehicle who gets into an accident, who was on a fixed price contract versus a cost reimbursable contract, and you're just wondering, are there any cases out there that have already been decided on who is liable for the damage to the vehicle? You can do a search at the Government Accountability Office's website on past cases. And I've put the website there where you can do those searches. And so it just allows you to do some research on previous decisions that have been made on similar issues. So on the previous slide, I talked about the CFR and then how that is the FPMR/FMR and the FAR, the FAR. And now I'm going to get you to the exact government-wide regulations that cover contractor use of government vehicles. And this is just a list. 41 CFR 102-34 is motor vehicle management. That's government-wide. 41 CFR 101-39 is the regulation that manages GSA Fleet, which is a leasing and purchasing arm of the government for motor vehicles. GSA Fleet also has a customer leasing guide and fleet drive-through, which has an entire section on contractor use of government vehicles. 41 CFR 102-5 is home to work transportation, i.e., who can drive a government vehicle home as part of their mission and how to get those approvals. The FAR subpart 51.2 is contractor use of interagency fleet management. This FAR subpart is applicable only if the contractor is leasing vehicles directly from GSA Fleet. Remember, I mentioned that earlier. If you're the Army and you have a motor pool of vehicles that you lease from GSA Fleet and you occasionally let contractors use them versus letting a contractor lease directly from GSA Fleet and they pay the bill themselves as part of a contract with the Army. So when the contractor's leasing vehicles directly from GSA Fleet, this FAR subpart applies, and we're going to go into more detail. I wanted to give you a reference for OPM. How are they involved? OPM has a regulation about motor vehicle operators, and it's not just a job series, but it's people who are drivers or incidental users of government vehicles and what's required for them. Most of that regulation, 5 CFR 930 subpart A, is for federal employees. But as you'll see later on, what we do for federal employees, the contracting officer should put in the contract the same requirements for contract employees. So if it's a medical examination or a license requirement, you'll find that in the OPM regulation 5 CFR 930 subpart A. And then once we go through all the government-wide regulations, I'm going to send you back to your agency and bureau. FMR supplements and regulations, and I have a good example of one at the end of this presentation. So let's dig into the basic government-wide regulation 41 CFR 102-34 motor vehicle management, which simply says, may government contractors use government motor vehicles? And the answer is yes. Government contractors may use government motor vehicles when authorized in accordance with the FAR, GSA Fleet procedures, and the following conditions. And we've been through some of this earlier, but it should be for official purposes only and solely in performance of the contract if they're going to be using government vehicles. As far as contractors, government vehicles cannot be used for transportation between residents and the place of employment unless it's been authorized in accordance with 31 U.S.C. 1344 and Part 102-5, which is the home to work transportation regulation. This regulation tells contractors that they must establish and enforce suitable penalties against employees who use or authorize the use of government motor vehicles for official purposes or for other than in the performance of the contract, and pay any expenses or costs without government reimbursement for using government motor vehicles other than in performance of the contract. So what C number 2 is saying, if there's incidental use, which is what is not official use, we call it incidental use. there must be something in the contract that allows for the government to be reimbursed for that. Most agencies don't allow incidental use of government vehicles, whether you're a federal employee or a contractor. But if it does occur, there needs to be a mechanism to get that reimbursement back for the federal government. And this is something you as a fleet manager will work with your contracting officers and your bureaus that deal more in the field to make sure that the contractors are adhering to the policies set forth. And that's when education is important. The contractor may not have known he wasn't allowed to do that. Whatever it is, incidental use can be something as little as they stopped for lunch en route. Does your agency allow that for employees and contractors? Or incidental use could be they had an emergency and picked up their child from the daycare center and only had the government vehicle with them. That's why it's important to take these government-wide regulations and write an internal agency policy on these issues and to educate the drivers, whether they're federal employees or contractors, when situations like these arise. If it's a contractor, the government, there needs to be a mechanism to reimburse the government. So I just went over 41 CFR 102-34, and that's the broad government-wide policy. And then the next one I'm going to talk about is 41 CFR 101-39. It's in the regulation right now as interagency fleet management systems. If you've been in the government a long time, you know what I'm talking about. But i.e., for short, they call themselves GSA Fleet now. And this regulation has not had a major update in a lot of years. It's in the works as we speak. And so hopefully soon that will be switched over to the FMR and given a 102 code. But right now it's still in 101-39 and it still says interagency fleet management systems. But wherever you see interagency fleet management systems, just remember that's GSA Fleet. It's the part of the GSA that leases vehicles to federal agencies and contractors, and they are also the mandatory source for purchasing motor vehicles. So as part of their regulation, as the services that they offer, is 101-39.202, contractor authorized services. Authorized contractors and subcontractors shall use related GSA fleet services solely for official purposes. So we had talked about there are some occasions that some agencies will allow incidental use of vehicles, but if you're leasing from GSA Fleet is saying if a contractor is going to use it, it has to be for official purposes only. Who determines official purposes? It's the federal agency does, as directed per your mission. So it's not GSA is going to determine if it's an official purpose or an official use. It's your agency that determines what is official use. So to the extent available, authorized contractors and subcontractors may use GSA fleet services on a reimbursable basis. Contractor use of GSA fleet services will be allowable only to the extent provided in the FAR, which we've talked about. And important to note, the use of GSA fleet vehicles in the performance of a contract, other than a cost reimbursement contract, requires pre-approval by the administrator of GSA. So if you have a firm fixed price contract and the contractors on that firm fixed price contract need to use the GSA fleet leased vehicles, you need to have a discussion with GSA Fleet and get that approved in advance. And GSA Fleet will tell you the reasons why. The way the regulation is written, only cost reimbursement contracts can use GSA Fleet vehicles without this pre-approval. GSA Fleet falls under 41 CFR 101-39, but they also have a GSA Fleet customer leasing guide. And if you lease from GSA Fleet, it's available in GSA Fleet drive-through. The most current copy, they update it every year. And so you want to go take a look at that if you lease from GSA Fleet. And they have an entire section on contractor use of government vehicles. And so what I've done is just pulled out some of the important things from that leasing guide that I thought would be helpful today for those participating in this webinar. Are authorized government contractors covered under the Federal Tort Claims Act while operating a GOV? We touched on this a little bit earlier. The answer is no. Usually no. I should change that to usually no. When authorized cost reimbursement government contractors or subcontractors use vehicles assigned to an agency, they must obtain their own insurance. The insurance policy should cover bodily injury, property damage with limits of liability as required by the customer agency. A lot of times, contractors will ask GSA Fleet, hey, how much insurance do we need to cover? And GSA Fleet does not make that determination. That's up to the agency and the agency's contracting officer to determine how much the liability insurance should be for. What is my personal liability as a federal employee or authorized contractor? And the answer is you are bound by state and local traffic laws, which is also it's a government-wide regulation. We must adhere to all state and local traffic laws. You must obey all motor vehicle traffic laws of your jurisdiction, except when the duties of your position require otherwise, with documentation. And you are personally responsible if you violate state or local traffic laws. So if you get a speeding ticket in a government vehicle, you're personally liable for that. Whether you're a federal employee or a contractor, if you drive through a toll booth and don't pay the toll, you're personally liable for the fine and the ticket. The original toll is usually reimbursable under local travel reimbursement policies. But if you get ticketed for not paying the toll, that ticket is and fine is personally your responsibility, whether you're an employee or a contractor. And the regulatory reasonings for those, number one, state and local traffic laws are found in 41 CFR 102-34.235. And basically that just says you must obey all state and local traffic laws. And then responsibility for damages. That if you lease from GSA Fleet, because remember I got this from the GSA Fleet Customer Leasing Guide, that can be found under 41 CFR 101-39.406. If you're the Army, sorry I keep using Army as an example, but just being consistent. If you're the Army and you have a motor pool of vehicles that you lease from GSA Fleet, and you allow contractors to use those vehicles, if a vehicle is in an accident, GSA Fleet is going to hold you, the Army, responsible for fixing that vehicle. But if your contractor is identifiable third party, and remember the contractor must have liability insurance from their company, GSA Fleet will try to recoup the money from the contractor, but ultimately it's the Army's responsibility to get that vehicle fixed. If you're a contractor that leases vehicles directly from GSA Fleet and you pay that bill, and your contractor is in an accident and is found negligent and responsible for the accident, GSA Fleet will go to the contractor to try to recoup that money. And they have insurance because they've already provided it to the contracting officer. So the system should be smooth, but how does it affect you as a fleet manager? Sometimes it doesn't because it's the contracting office that's coordinating that. But then other times it's the fleet manager's responsibility. I mentioned that earlier. The contract drivers who are getting your vehicles, getting the keys from you, make sure they're licensed and insured for the type of vehicle they are driving. Each agency handles personal liability a little differently, and then if there's ever any questions, don't be afraid to contact your agency's general counsel office for specific guidance. That's what they're there for, to help, is to contact your agency general counsel for specific guidance on your agency and your mission requirements. So in the fleet leasing guide, it says to contact your local FSR for information on contractor use requests of GSA fleet vehicles, but they also have this nice email address that you can send requests to, contractoruse_requests@gsa.gov, in case you have any questions about contractor use of GSA fleet vehicles. They can help you. So we went over the government-wide regulation for contractor use of government vehicles. We went over the GSA fleet regulation about contractor use of GSA fleet leased vehicles. And now we're going to dig a little bit into federal acquisition regulation, the FAR. It's the subpart 51.2, contractor use of interagency fleet management system vehicles. And what did I say earlier? Anytime you see interagency fleet management system vehicles written anywhere, it means i.e. GSA fleet. So for the purposes of this slide and presentation, I went ahead and put GSA fleet in there, but if you actually go back and read the FAR yourself, you're still going to see IFMS everywhere in there. So the policy that's in the FAR is if it's in the government's interest, the contracting officer, and notice it says contracting officer, it doesn't say supervisor, it doesn't say fleet manager, it says the contracting officer may authorize cost reimbursement contracts to obtain for official purposes only GSA fleet vehicles and related services. So just remember, when contractors want to use government vehicles, you as a fleet manager can't solely authorize that. It has to be authorized in the contract by the contracting officer. So they can get related services from GSA fleet that's listed under A, and we talked a little bit about, this is where the FAR says it has to be a cost reimbursement contract. If it's not a cost reimbursable contract, you have to get the administrator of GSA and GSA fleet's permission to allow the contractors to drive GSA fleet vehicles. Second part of this regulation is the authorization. The contracting officer may authorize a cost reimbursement contractor to obtain GSA fleet vehicles if the contracting officer has, and it's 1 through 6, determine the authorization will accomplish the agency's mission and affect demonstrable economies. Is it advantageous to the government to allow the contractor access to GSA fleet vehicles? The contracting officer must receive evidence of motor vehicle liability insurance with the limits as required or approved by the agency. Again, GSA can't make that determination on the limits of liability, the actual dollar amounts of the liability insurance. It should protect the contractor and the government against third-party claims arising from the ownership, maintenance, and use of GSA fleet vehicles. The contracting officer must put in the contract that they have arranged for periodic checks to ensure the authorized contractors are using vehicles and related services exclusively under a cost reimbursement contract. And the contracting officer must ensure the contractors have established and enforce suitable penalties for the employees who use or authorize the use of government vehicles for other than a performance of a government contract. So we talked about incidental use earlier. So if their contracting officer is made aware of incidental use, the suitable penalties should already be written into the contract. The FAR requires it. and that the contracting officer has received a written statement that the contractor will assume without the right of reimbursement from the government the cost or expense of any use of GSA fleet vehicles and services not related to the performance of the contract, i.e. the vehicles have to be used for the performance of the contract. And then the contracting officer should consider any recommendations of the contractor. The contractor may have other thoughts or ideas of how to provide motor vehicle transportation for this contract. And so as long as these are met and the contracting officer has put this into their negotiations and written it into the contract, the contractor should be able to get use of GSA fleet vehicles. So the authorization shall be in writing, cite the contract number, specify any limitations on the authority, including its duration and any other pertinent information. You as a fleet manager, you should have a copy of this. If you routinely give contractors government vehicles to use, you need to have a good relationship with that CO, with that contracting officer. Know what the limits are, and then that will help you educate the contract drivers who may not be aware of any of this because their own company hasn't told them this. But you as a fleet manager can ask for copies of these. And then a contracting officer is authorizing contractor use of GSA fleet vehicles and related services, subject their agencies to the responsibilities and liabilities provided in 41 CFR 101-39.4 regarding accidents and claims. We talked about GSA fleet's regulations about who's responsible for an accident and how a claim's going to be mitigated. Then that would be written into the contract too to follow 41 CFR 101-39. So continuing with the FAR regulation about the use of GSA fleet vehicles, 51.203 talks about how to obtain the service, but this also is a little dated, this FAR subpart 51.2. And they discuss a means of obtaining service, but it was a little outdated. And so I just put that GSA Fleet's email address, contractor use request at gsa.gov. If you email them, they will give you the most up-to-date means of obtaining GSA Fleet services. The regulation is just a little outdated. 51.204 is use of GSA fleet vehicles and related services. Contractors authorized to use GSA fleet vehicles and related services should comply with the regulation and the customer leasing guide. And 102-5 is home to work transportation. The required contract clause, if the contractor is leasing directly from GSA fleet and being billed, this contract clause has to be in the contract. It's insert clause 52.251-2. And it just says that they can lease from GSA fleet, they will maintain the vehicles, and shall be in accordance with the regulations, which we've already mentioned. So those are the government-wide regulations. We went over 102-34, motor vehicle management, government-wide, 101-39, GSA fleet, and we went over the FAR, 51.2, subpart 51.2. So there's just some other little regulations out there which always come up several times a month sometimes, and I just wanted to make sure if you have contractors using government vehicles that you're aware of these. And there's the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Act. It's the act that you see trucks on the road, freight trucks, tractor trailers, whatever term you want to call for them. You see them stopping to get weighed. You see they have to pass certain inspections. You've heard terms of the drivers have to have logs and medical examinations. And so what the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Act says, only federal employees driving government-owned or leased vehicles are exempt from certain portions of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Act. So federally owned and operated vehicles, i.e. not for hire contractors, are not subject to 49 CFR 390 through 399, which includes the medical requirements and the hours of service, because they are not considered in commerce. The CDL and drug and alcohol regs would apply if they are operating certain size vehicles. So what does this have to do with contractors? Special note here. If a contractor is driving a government vehicle, and it's not a federal employee driving the vehicle, the contractor must comply with all rules of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Act. So notice the distinction here. The Act allows federal employees to be exempt from a lot of provisions of that Act. But if you put a contract driver behind the wheel of a government vehicle, the contractor must comply with all rules of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Act. For more information on that, I've included their website there, and it'll take you straight to the regulations and they'll talk about it's only if you're only exempt as if you're a federal employee. Another place that contractor use of government vehicles is listed is in Executive Order 13513. This was signed October 1st, 2009, and it was just federal leadership on reducing text messaging while driving. In Section 4 of the executive order, they specifically ask that each agency in their contracts include and enforce policies that ban text messaging while driving company-owned or rented or GOVs, or while driving POVs when on official government business, or when performing any work for or on behalf of the government. So basically, this is just saying that when you're writing your contracts and you have contractors driving government vehicles, and even if they're driving company-owned vehicles or even a privately owned vehicle, that you should tell them that if they're performing official government business, they may not text while driving. Agencies should also encourage federal contractors to consider the new rules and programs. You need to reevaluate existing programs to prohibit text messaging while driving. And they want you to conduct education, awareness, and outreach for employees about the safety risk associated with texting while driving. So here, as a fleet manager, here again, you may be tasked to provide education, not just on the contractor use of vehicles, but how the contractor is using the vehicle, i.e. you can't text and drive when conducting government business. These initiatives should encourage voluntary compliance with the agency's text messaging policy while off duty. So that's just what this executive order was asking, and as a fleet manager, you should also take that into consideration when you're coming up with your own policies. So this is just a slide that I wanted to put the next two in so that you can just print it, keep it up for you to see. Just can a contractor drive a GOV? Yes. If the regulatory and agency requirements are met, the applicable regulations, 41 CFR 102-34 is the government-wide regulation on motor vehicle management. The FAR clause, contractor use of GSA fleet vehicles, and then 41 CFR 101-39 is GSA fleet regulation. Some considerations: has the contracting officer authorized use of the GOV? Does the contractor have liability insurance? And do the drivers have state driver's license for applicable vehicle type? And then the next one always comes up too. Can I transport a non-federal passenger in my government vehicle? I kept that kind of nondescript. I didn't use the word contractor per se because there's other types of non-federal folks who could be in your government vehicle. It could be a visiting scientist. It could be a volunteer. And so the answer usually is yes. as if it's for official use. Official use is performing your mission as defined and authorized by your agency. Official use can include transporting a non-federal passenger. Just a reminder, the Federal Tort Claims Act covers federal employees in scope of employment, and to contact your agency fleet manager and or general counsel office for internal agency policy or guidance. So where do I go for policy questions in my agency? Your agency fleet or personal property manager, your agency general counsel's office. The general counsel's office would rather you ask the question than to put yourself or an employee or a contractor in a situation that would cause them personal liability or the government liability. So ask your general counsel's office. Don't be afraid to keep pushing forward and say, nope, I need the GC's opinion on this. Talk to your contracting officer with regards to the contractor use of government resources. I know as a fleet manager, it may be impossible. There could be 100 contracts on base that are allowing contractors to use government vehicles. But you just need to make sure the proper policies are in place before you hand them the keys. And getting to know the contracting office on your site will help you have a better understanding of that relationship about contractor use of government vehicles. And I want to direct you to use agency directives and guidance and documents. I'm just going to not go over this, but this is a sample agency policy I found with just a general internet search. It was from a presentation, actually, that they were given, an education session they were giving. And this agency, this is what they said. Contractors may be a passenger in government vehicle, no appearance of favoritism, and government employees generally may not ride in a contract vehicle. So I thought that was interesting. The best policy I saw out there in my internet search last week was this one. It was an agency policy statement, and it was contractor use of government and privately owned vehicles. And as you can see, they kind of dive a little bit into everything that we've talked about today. And if you'd seen the whole document, it even has forms attached to this agency policy statement about contractor use of government vehicles. Your agency does have this. You need to find it for your agency. So we are 1:53. I didn't leave much time for questions, but wanted to thank you. And do we have any questions that came through?
No questions have come through during your presentation. I don't know if you want to just give it a
good.
In case, you know, it prompts an idea from one of our participants.
These are just two of the two sample policies. I wasn't sure we had time to go over them that I came across. Like I said, each agency has or should have a policy on contractor use of vehicles. These are just two that I found with a real quick internet search. I really like the second one. It's about 4 or 5 pages long, and I just kind of took a screenshot of the first page. And so if you just do a general search of contractor use of government and privately owned vehicles, this will pop up, I promise. But it's just real helpful. There's no sense in reinventing the wheel. If you find out that you don't have an agency policy, like copy others and then go to your general counsel's office to make sure it's all applicable. And something I did not mention, but contractor vehicles used by contractors are reportable. Remember I talked about how many vehicles were in the federal government? It's because GSA collects that data, and contractors are reporting that data to GSA in a system called FAST, Federal Automotive Statistical Tool. So that's all I had today about contractor use of government vehicles. It's a very long subject, and I kind of jammed everything into just a few slides today. So read it and hopefully you have found it helpful, and we'll tell you where to go to get some help and assistance with contractor use of government vehicles.
A couple of questions have come through. One of them is wanting to know if copies of the presentation will be available.
I don't know. How does NPMA handle that? I mean, you guys have a copy, right? Oh, you post it online later, don't you?
I think that
the webinar recording will be available through our NPMA YouTube channel. If I do have a copy of your slides, Connie, and if you are okay with that, if folks your email information is up on one of these slides I thought I saw. If they email you or myself, again, this is Kim Sager, you know, we could share that if you're okay with that. But
yeah, that's fine. Yes.
Okay.
Another question that came through is asking, is a four-wheel of road vehicle considered part of a fleet? The vehicle is, I'm not sure, OCONUS?
Maybe like a ATV. I'm not sure what kind of vehicle that is either. Usually our regulations, the ones I went over today, only refer to vehicles that can be run legally on public roadways. So if it's a vehicle that can be legally run on a public roadway in your state, which most like ATVs are, I can't think of what they are now, like golf cart type things, then the answer would no, these wouldn't apply.
They actually responded and says, yes, it is an ATV type of vehicle.
Right. So if it can't be run legally on a public roadway, then these would not, the government-wide regulations would not apply, but I suggest you look for your internal agency regulation on contractor use of light vehicles.
Thank you. And Kim, that's all the questions that came through.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. So thank you, Connie, again for your great presentation. And also on the screen right now, which is exciting, you can see the information for our next NPMA webinar, which is next Thursday, January 23rd. So if you have not signed up and would like to participate, go ahead onto our NPMA website under our Fleet Management Awareness Month webpage, and you can register.
Can I give a little plug for that real quick? We'll get 2 minutes, right?
You can. Scott would appreciate that.
So those of us in the federal fleet community, we're not too attuned to the ASTM standard guide for motorized equipment, but it was written by a federal person, Bob Holcomb, who is the guru of all personal property management in the federal government. And so he worked in collaboration with a consortium of folks to develop this new standards. And it's OMB who says that government property managers should follow the ASTM standard guides. And now there is one for motorized equipment. And so please join Scott next week, learn more about it. If you're a fleet geek guru, you'll go, oh, wow, okay. You know, it'll click in your head. So just a little plug for that. OMB does direct federal agencies to follow these new guidelines, and we're just getting involved in this in the federal government into the motor vehicle world. So sign up for next week.
Thanks again, Connie. And hopefully we'll have you all next week. Thanks again for attending.
Thank you.